I have been thinking a lot about what I don't like about the new Pokemon games, and part of that is a mix of corporate greed and unpolished games being released year after year, but I inevitably come back to one simple question that must be answered first, and that is, what do I even like about Pokemon in the first place? Especially since, despite all the games in recent memory, it is still one of my top 3 favorite video game franchises of all time. And to answer that, all roads lead me back to one place, the first generation of games I really completed, and arguably my favorite generation of Pokemon games, Generation 3 on the Game Boy Advance. And I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, ever since I finished my retrospectives on the Pokemon Emerald and Fire Red Leaf Green games. And I think the more casual format might do this some justice. I think the main reason I'm making this is because in the past I've never really gotten to talk about the things that don't really work well in a retrospective dedicated to a specific games and thing. Or I talk more about things like the story, the battle mechanics, individual Pokemon that I was using, when I think some of the things that truly make this generation awesome are the basics and the foundation of the games. And the things that truly make this generation awesome has a lot to do with the fan base around these games, and I would include myself as a Gen 3 lover and as a core member of that fan base, and the everything behind the scenes that makes them possible. If you haven't really caught on by now, I'm actually going to be talking a lot about the foundation of what these games are built on, and especially what that has led to with things like ROM hacks and fan games. And not exclusively, of course, but I think the fact that this generation really revolutionized them for the series is what makes these games so immortalized in the larger Pokemon fanbase. And a lot of the reasons for that and why that's even possible is the foundation of the original Gen 3 games themselves. One of the most important things that really makes these games stand out is definitely the atmosphere and just the visual style of these games. The Game Boy Advance visual style is just something like a special Goldilocks zone for me of quality. It is higher than an NES and a Game Boy or a Game Boy Color, but a little bit lower than an SNES, despite having plenty of SNES titles on the Game Boy Advance. But I think there's just something very pleasing visually about the Game Boy Advance style, and it's why I even have a book about Game Boy Advance games, pixel art, and whatnot. And I think it's really perfect, especially for newcomers into pixel art. I am not an artist by any means, I mean really at all, but I even found myself dabbling a bit into pixel art with more of a GBA style in mind. I've never admitted this in a video, at least I don't think I have, but I actually did work on a Pokemon ROM hack and a Fire Emblem ROM hack back in the day using some of the more rudimentary tools that were around maybe 10 years ago. And one of my favorite parts was actually just making the pixel art, and probably what I focused on the most about the whole process, and that's why I will probably never release that unless maybe I get 100,000 subscribers, then maybe I'll release it. But it's a piece of shit, so don't look forward to it. But there's something so alive about the color palette as well in these games that I just think makes sense, and something that just inspires the masses. I felt like there was always a little bit more variety in the routes and stuff in the original Gen 3 games, with the larger ocean routes, which I know a lot of people don't like, but I did like them. I think caves were also much more expanded in these games versus Generation 1 and 2. And there's just something about it that just felt like I was discovering secrets in this game much more than the original 2 games. And the final thing about the atmosphere of Generation 3 Pokemon that really makes it stand out is the music is completely iconic. Generation 3 music is some of my favorite, and whether you're talking about even how it was not upscaled, made a little bit more orchestral, and things like Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire just really show how good the music in these games really was, despite being on hardware that kind of limited music's potential. The trumpets in Generation 3 just really live rent-free in my mind, and it's also some of the first video game music that I always found that I would just listen to on my own when I'm not playing the game, and just while I'm studying for homework or something. Another thing about these games, I just felt that they were much more focused in their scope. There was enough complexity to feel a little bit more strategic with more expanded abilities, natures, EVs debuted here, but still kind of simple enough that you weren't buried under systems, and I didn't feel like I was min-maxing too much in these games. And some of the more modern Pokemon games, despite having so many weird little features, it definitely feels a little bit bloated. There's things like camping and raids and games like Pokemon Sword and Shield that I just really had no interest in doing, so they were kind of just in the way of the experience when I did have to use them a little bit more. They were kind of in the way of the core experience of what I wanted to play, and really broadened the scope, didn't really add to the things that I liked the most about Pokemon games. And in contrast, the Game Boy Advance games are just very tight design focused games about catching Pokemon, battling, exploring, and just repeating that. And because they did focus in on especially that main focus of battling and exploring, we did get things like the Battle Frontier in Pokemon Emerald for the very first time. And this is one of the best additions to a Pokemon game that really expands on the post-game of a Pokemon game without really doing too much. It is essentially just a gauntlet challenge of Pokemon battles with a bunch of different trainers, but I think it's one of the foundations of why so many people started getting into competitive battling, and what really got me more interested in starting to just battle more people besides for just my friend next door. The challenge in these games was also near perfect, where you have a game like Fire Red and Leaf Green that are really one of the best games in general for newcomers, but then you also have some slightly harder games in Pokemon Emerald. And this design philosophy is also seen heavily in the Pokemon ROM hack scene. You do have a lot of more difficult ROM hacks like Pokemon Light Platinum, or even more straightforward difficulty hacks like Pokemon Inclement Emerald, for just a couple of my favorite ones. But then you also have just so many story-based ones that I think would actually even be good for a newcomer to just start playing for the very first time. Even if it would probably be a little bit weird to not start with one of the original games, but one of my favorites is definitely Pokemon Ash Gray. It's been a very long time since I've played that game, but just being able to play through the Pokemon anime in a game format is one of the best experiences I think I've ever had with a Pokemon ROM hack. Some other notable standouts were games like Pokemon Snakewood, which is such a weird vibe to experience for a Pokemon game, but that is just kind of the creativity the fan base has been allowed to explore with this generation's art style and atmosphere, and to also break some of the conventions, as well as just an overall good game. I think is like Pokemon Glazed was another one of my favorites. But playing games like Pokemon Unbound pretty recently have really even opened my eyes even further at where Pokemon ROM hacks can actually go. I mean, in games like this, we fully have full-length side quests, we have NPCs with actual personality, and we even have full-length cutscenes. There's just so much to love. It's really an exciting place to still be even years and years later after they've first started making these kind of games. And I've only played through the first couple hours of Pokemon Unbound, but it's really gotten me much more entranced playing this game than paying $70 for something like Pokemon Legends ZA, which I'm not even excited to play. And something like this, I'd just much rather support the artists who are making these things that they love essentially for free and maybe some donations, rather than someone who is going to make a more middling product. And even when you move further into fan games or games that are borderline just full games that they've made on Steam that don't even use the Pokemon title, they're just such high quality these days that honestly, when it comes to people complaining so much, like I kind of do sometimes about games like Pokemon ZA, it makes you wonder, why don't you just go play these other things that are obviously inspired by that instead of wasting your time thinking about this $70 game, or at least just go buy it used or on sale in like a year or something. But I don't know, there's just something that's so fun to watch fans make such high quality versions of trying to emulate their favorite series and expand on their childhood favorite game, and it just ends up being quite the dilemma, I think, for say the Pokemon company on what to do about this, because they're never really going to be able to completely squash out these Pokemon ROM hacks and fan games, and they're honestly keeping us eating good. When we're talking about Pokemon ROM hacks, something that I maybe don't have the complete expertise to talk about is all the coding and framework for the game in the background. And I don't know exactly what it is, other than reading about it and listening to some other people talk about how the framework is simpler. I don't exactly know how that works, but it does seem to be true that these games were much easier to hack on a Game Boy Advance than even like an NES and an SNES. And it looks eventually people made tools that idiots like me could even use for Fire Emblem ROM hacking or Pokemon ROM hacking. And from what I remember, at least back in the day, some of the first actual tools that a normal person could actually operate without pretty much any coding experience were from the Pokemon community with Pokemon Game Boy Advance games. In those tools, it's so much easier to just see what you're actually adjusting when you're creating maps, or to even import all your own artwork into the game without having to go into like hex editing, which again, I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but I do remember as a kid, I would even go as far as to make small little color palette changes with hex editing before I even knew the existence of any sort of like PC-based tools that allowed you to ROM hack the entire thing. But why this is so much different than a lot of the other games is the 3D games just don't allow for this custom ability. I mean, I know you can just throw random models into a lot of 3D games, but there's just something so charming about pixel art, and I think it's why even today people heavily focus on a more GBA or even a DS style game rather than going to the 3D games for their fan game needs. But I won't glaze them all too much. There are definitely downsides. These games are not perfect, and when you have a whole history of games that have come after it, I can see why newer fans might just not be as interested in Generation 3, and by virtue playing ROM hacks in that style, there's no physical special split, which is easily the biggest glaring hole in these games. But I mean, this is where ROM hacking does come into play, because a lot of ROM hacks will add the physical special split, and you can play whole versions of pretty vanilla versions of like things like Pokemon Emerald and Fire Red and Leaf Green and stuff with just adding the physical special split, and then you're gonna get your post-gen 4 experience. The base games also still have a lot of that HM bullshit that, you know, especially after playing games where they don't have that, it's harder to go back to the games that have a lot of HM bullshit. But again, fan games and ROM hacks and things, I think they kind of rein that in a little bit better. I also have never resonated with the whole too much water issue of these games. I personally have always thought that the water is a total vibe, especially diving and the music related to that. For the music alone, it makes diving worth it and makes me actually want to do it. And also playing Generation 2 pretty recently for another retrospective type video, it is weird that we lost the day-night cycle, and I know there's some ROM hacks that kind of, or fan games that kind of bring that back, of course, but in the core games, you kind of lost that. And also with Generation 2 to Generation 3, this is also one of the only times that there was no real easy backwards compatibility where you can move your Generation 2 Pokemon onto Generation 3. And from this point forward, that has been a standard. I mean, sometimes you've had to pay for it or something, but it has been a series standard going forward. And here it is a gap where that is not as easily possible. But despite some of these more criticisms about Generation 3, I do still think that these games hold their own in today's world. And I think you can go back and play these for the very first time or for replaying purposes, which is why I went back and played them for a retrospective, to just give it a little bit more thought to these games. And that's why I wanted to eventually make this video where I talked about all the other things that are around Generation 3 especially, that just make them so special, that are not dedicated specifically to the core gameplay and story experience of Pokemon Emerald and Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. Because I just think there's so many other things that those games brought to the fan base of Pokemon and to the franchise that have just made it that despite even the newer games not being too great, they've just brought so much life into the fan base, and I think they really are what give it a lot of longevity overall. Because even if Game Freak and Nintendo went under, or they stopped making Pokemon games, we know we would always still have Pokemon ROM hacks and Pokemon fan games, or it's one of the reasons I'm also lately have just been not as gung-ho about needing to play the newest Pokemon game on release on day one, just because I know if I really want to get the core experience I want to play and what I value from a Pokemon game, I can always go to a Gen 3 style ROM hack or a Gen 3 style fan game that are really just going to hook me in with some nostalgia bait, while also just giving me an overall fun new experience or a new way of seeing a game that I love so much. Anyways, that's really all I wanted to talk about with Generation 3, one of my favorite generations of Pokemon games. And this just kind of extends some bit to like the DS games a little bit. You know, there's a lot more there's more ROM hacks of DS games as well, and fan games that look a little bit more like a DS game rather than a GBA game. But we're not talking about this today. Maybe we'll talk about those a little bit later at another date. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this more laid back video that's a little bit different, where I just wanted to talk about something that I have never talked about on this channel. And with that being said, hope you have a good rest of your day, good rest of your week, and see you in the next video.